The rope bridge snapped under the wagon wheel just as Reuben Graves threw himself sideways, and the last thing he saw before the world tilted was the orc woman's single good eye locking onto his, blazing gold in the storm light, as she lunged across the breaking planks and caught his wrist in a grip like iron. "Do not fall, farmer," she growled, hauling him against her body as the bridge groaned and split beneath them, the ravine below swallowed in mist and the roar of a swollen river. "I did not come all this way to fish your corpse out of the rocks." He had 30 pounds and no leverage against her, and it did not matter because she simply pivoted, planted one boot on a beam that had not yet given way, and threw them both toward the far bank as the last of the bridge fell away into the gorge with a sound like the world tearing in half. They hit the muddy slope hard, rolled together in a tangle of limbs and cloak, and her long dark hair come loose from its braid, and came to rest with him half beneath her, her forearm braced across his chest, both of them breathing hard and alive. For a long moment neither of them moved. "You are heavier than you look," she said finally, though her voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. "You are stronger than you look," Reuben managed, "and you look like you could tear a plow horse in half, so that is saying something." Vrogash Ironhide laughed then, a startled, genuine bark of sound, and rolled off him to sit in the mud with the rain running down the scarred ruin where her left eye had once been, and something in Reuben's chest turned over like a stone in a riverbed, because he understood, looking at her, that he had somehow gone and fallen in love with a woman who could have let him die and instead had chosen, without hesitation, to save him. It had started, as these things sometimes do, with a bet neither of them should have made. 3 weeks earlier, Reuben had been standing in the mud of his own collapsing hog pen, cursing a rotten fence post, when the trading agent from Blackwater Harbor rode up the coast road with news that turned his stomach to lead. His homestead's note was overdue again, the 3rd season running, ever since the blight had taken his wheat, and the fever had taken his father and left him alone to work land that had once supported 3 men. The agent, a narrow, oily fellow named Corliss Vane, had smiled with all his teeth and told him the bank in the harbor town would take the farm come spring, unless Reuben found 40 crowns he plainly did not have. 40 crowns was more coin than Reuben Graves had seen in a single place in 5 years. So when word came down the wagon trail that the orc clans of the northern coast were sending emissaries to Blackwater Harbor to negotiate a peace bond with the human settlements, and that the Harbor Council was offering good coin to any local man willing to serve as guide and go-between for the visiting delegation, Reuben had swallowed his pride, put on his one good coat, and walked the 6 miles into town to put his name forward. He had not expected to be laughed at by half the Harbor Council. He had not expected, either, to be the only man in the room who did not flinch when the orc delegation walked in. She came through the doors of the harbor hall like the coast itself had sent her, tall as any 2 men, her leather traveling armor laced tight over a body built for war and moving like she had never once in her life doubted her welcome anywhere. Her skin was a deep mossy green, weathered by wind and sun, and her dark hair was pulled back in a braid thick as a ship's rope. A jagged white scar ran from her brow down across where her left eye should have been, the socket old and healed and unhidden by any patch, and her remaining eye, a fierce molten gold, swept the room once and found every coward, every sneer, every hand that drifted toward a hidden knife, before it settled, for reasons Reuben could not have explained even to himself, on him. "This is the one," she said to the Harbor Council, in accented but clear common speech without preamble. "The farmer at the end of the hall who has not yet decided whether to run or to bow. I will speak with him." The council, made up mostly of merchants and a harbor magistrate named Aldous Pike who had never done an honest day's labor in his soft, pale life, looked at Reuben with something between relief and contempt, glad enough to hand the difficult orc woman off to the poorest man in the room. "That is Reuben Graves," Pike said dismissively. "A farmer, nobody of consequence." "Good," said Vrogash Ironhide, and there was something like humor in the way she said it, dry and sharp as flint. "I am tired of men of consequence. They lie more efficiently." Reuben's face had gone hot, but he had held her gaze, that single molten eye, and said, "I would rather be nobody of consequence than somebody who cannot look a stranger in the face, sir," which had earned him a startled bark of laughter from the orc woman, and a look of pure venom from Magistrate Pike, and that more than anything had sealed his fate. The task, as it was explained to him over the following days, was simple in the way that a snake is simple until it bites you. The orc clans of the Ashfall Ridge, the mountainous coast north of Blackwater Harbor, had lost a sacred relic during the border wars 2 generations past. A curved bronze horn banded with silver, called the Tusk Collar, said to have belonged to the first war chief who had ever brokered peace between orc and human on this coast. Whoever held the Tusk Collar was owed a debt of honor by both peoples, and the clan that had lost it in battle had never forgiven the theft. It was rumored, credibly enough, that the Harbor Council had staked its entire peace treaty on the rumor that the horn had ended up in Blackwater Harbor itself, sold off decades ago by a dying soldier, and now sat somewhere in the town, in someone's private hoard, gathering dust and old blood debts. Vrogash Ironhide had come south with a small honor guard to find it, or to declare formally, before both peoples, that the humans of the harbor were oath breakers and thieves, which would mean war along the whole northern coast by summer. The council needed someone who knew the town, the fishing families, the old smugglers' warehouses along the docks, someone the orc woman would trust enough to work beside without a blade drawn. They needed Reuben Graves, whether they liked it or not, and so a bargain was struck on the spot, blunt and binding. Reuben would guide Vrogash through Blackwater Harbor for 1 month to search for the relic, and if the horn was found and peace secured, the council would pay him the 40 crowns to save his farm. If he failed, or if the orc delegation judged the town guilty of theft and withdrew in anger, he would get nothing, and likely neither would anyone else in Blackwater Harbor, not for a long while, not once the raiding began again. "Why me?" Reuben had asked her, once the council had scattered and it was just the 2 of them left standing on the harbor hall steps in the gray coastal light, gulls screaming overhead and fishing boats creaking at anchor below. "There must be 100 men in this town better suited to guarding you through it. Bigger men, armed men." Vrogash had studied him with her single eye, unhurried, the way a woman might study a horse she was considering buying, though there was nothing cold in it. "I have been looked at by many men since I lost this eye, farmer. Some look at the scar with pity, some with disgust. Some, worse, pretend not to see it at all and speak too loudly and too carefully, as though I have gone deaf along with blind." She reached up, unself-conscious, and traced one blunt green finger along the ridge of the old wound. "You looked at the scar for exactly as long as it took to notice it, and then you looked at my other eye instead to see what I was thinking. That is a rare thing, Reuben Graves." I have decided to trust it. He had not known what to say to that, so he had said the only true thing in him. "It is a hell of a scar, must have been a hell of a battle." "It was," she agreed, and for a moment something old and grieved passed behind her golden eye, there and gone like a cloud shadow on water. "The other eye saw enough of it for both that day. It has seen enough for both ever since." That first evening, he had walked her down through the crooked streets of Blackwater Harbor toward the boarding house on Gull Street, where the council had grudgingly arranged lodging for the orc delegation, and the whole town had turned out to watch, exactly as he had known they would. Fishermen mending nets on the pilings stopped with their hands full of twine to stare. A cluster of netmongers' wives drew their children back against the shop fronts as though Vrogash Ironhide were a wolf loosed in the street, rather than a woman walking beside a farmer she had chosen out of a crowded hall. Old Captain Pharaoh, who had lost his brother in the last border skirmish 30 years past, stood in the door of his chandlery with his jaw set hard enough to crack teeth, and did not look away, and did not speak, which in Blackwater Harbor was its own kind of curse. Vrogash walked through all of it with her chin up and her stride unhurried, as though the whispers and the stares were wind she had long since learned to walk against, and it was Reuben, not her, who found his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Ignore them," she said quietly, not looking at him. "It costs nothing, farmer, and it teaches them nothing either way to see you angry on my behalf. Save your fists for something that will bend to them." "They have no right," he said. "No," she agreed, "they do not. And they will go on being wrong at me regardless of whether you scowl at them or not. But I confess," and here, unexpectedly, a small private smile touched the corner of her mouth, "it is not the worst thing to have a man scowl on my behalf. It has been some time since anyone bothered." That, he would think later, lying awake in his small farmhouse with the wind rattling the shutters, was the first moment he understood that Vrogash Ironhide was not merely tolerating his company for the sake of the bargain. She was watching him the way he was watching her, weighing him, and for reasons he could not name, he wanted very badly to be found worth the wait. The search for the tusk caller took them through every warehouse, cellar, and dusty attic along the Blackwater waterfront over the following 2 weeks, and it was during those weeks, crouched together over old sea chests and moth-eaten ledgers, that Reuben Graves learned the particular music of Vrogash Ironhide's laughter, low and rare and startling as a bell in fog, and the particular danger of wanting to hear it again. She was, he discovered, absolutely merciless in an argument, and delighted by nothing so much as being proven right. When old Widow Hask, who ran the harbor's largest fish-smoking shed, tried to overcharge them a full crown to search her storage cellar, Vrogash had simply crossed her powerful arms, looked the widow up and down with her single golden eye, and said, "You are asking a fair price to search a room that has not been swept in a decade. For a relic you are certain is not there. From a woman you are certain will not haggle because she frightens you. That is 3 separate insults to my intelligence in one breath, and I find I resent the third one most." Widow Hask had gone scarlet and dropped the price to 2 coppers on the spot, and Vrogash had walked away from the shed grinning like a cat, delighted with herself, while Reuben laughed so hard he had to lean against a piling to stay upright. "You enjoyed that entirely too much," he told her. "I enjoy very little in this town," she said. "I take my pleasures where the current provides them." They found no horn in Widow Hask's cellar, nor in the Customs House archive, nor in the back room of the Anchor and Rope Tavern, where the harbor's oldest smugglers still drank away their memories. But they found, in each other's company, something neither of them had expected to find at all. Reuben found himself telling her, over a shared meal of smoked herring and hard bread on a sea wall at dusk, about his father's death 2 winters past, the fever that had taken him in 3 days, how Reuben had buried him alone because there had been no coin to hire mourners and no family left to call. Vrogash listened without pity, which he found he was grateful for, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, watching the gulls wheel over the darkening water. "My mother died in the same border war that took my eye," she said finally. "A human soldier's arrow, though it was not the one that blinded me. I spent many years hating every human I met for that arrow, farmer. It would have been easier in some ways to go on hating. Why didn't you?" "Because hate is heavy," she said, "and I grew tired of carrying it everywhere I walked. And because," and here she turned that molten gold eye on him, direct and unguarded in a way that made his breath catch, "I have found since coming south that some humans are worth setting the weight down for." He had not kissed her that night, though he had wanted to with an intensity that frightened him a little, an ache that sat behind his ribs like a held breath. He had walked her back to Gull Street instead, and stood a moment too long at the boarding-house door, and she had reached out and brushed one thumb, rough and warm, along his jaw, slow and deliberate, and said, "Sleep well, farmer," in a voice gone low and unsteady, before she disappeared inside, and he had walked the 6 miles home in the dark grinning like a fool the whole way, his skin still burning where she had touched him. The banter between them had teeth from the very start, and it only sharpened as the days went on. the two of them trading barbs across every warehouse and dockside stall like a courtship conducted entirely in insults that both of them understood as something else entirely. "You walk like a man who has never once in his life been afraid of anything larger than a chicken," she told him one afternoon, watching him climb an unsteady ladder into a hayloft to search an old shipping crate. "I have been afraid of exactly one thing larger than a chicken in the last month," he called down, "and she is standing at the bottom of this ladder critiquing my climbing." "I'm not critiquing," Vrogash said, entirely unrepentant. "I am admiring the view. There is a difference." He had nearly fallen off the ladder at that, and her laughter had followed him the rest of the afternoon like sunlight through the barn slats. She teased him, too, about his farm, once he had finally admitted, red-faced, exactly why he had put his name forward for this dangerous, thankless work. "A homestead farmer," she said, turning the words over like she was tasting them. "You grow wheat and raise hogs and mend fences, and yet here you are, walking an armed orc woman through the most dangerous quarter of your own town, arguing with widows and climbing into haylofts, because you refuse to lose the last thing your father left you. I think, Reuben Graves, that you are considerably braver than a man who merely fights battles for a living." "I think," he said, "that you are considerably kinder than a woman who has spent a month listening to my whole town whisper about her behind cupped hands, and I have not yet figured out why you bother being kind to any of us at all." "I am not kind to any of you," she corrected, stepping close enough that he could smell the salt and leather and something warmer underneath, something like wood smoke and clean sweat that had started, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, to feel like the smell of home. "I am kind to you. There is, again, a difference, farmer, and I would think by now you would have learned to notice it." It was on the 18th day of the search. With less than 2 weeks left before the deadline the orc clan had set for peace or war, that Corliss Vane, the very trading agent who had first ridden out to Reuben's farm with news of the debt, made the mistake that would nearly get them both killed. They had traced a rumor through 3 separate taverns to an old smuggler named Ossie Brandt, half-blind with drink and long past caring what he said to who told them, in exchange for a jug of harbor rum, that the tusk collar had indeed washed up in Blackwater decades ago, carried south by a deserting soldier, and had eventually been bought quietly by a wealthy merchant who did not want his name spoken aloud in connection with stolen war relics. That merchant, Ossie said with a wet, gap-toothed grin, was none other than Corliss Vane's own father, dead these 10 years, and the horn, if it still existed, would be sitting in the Vane family's private strong-room above the counting house on Harbor Street. Reuben and Vrogash had gone to Corliss Vane directly, hoping for a quiet resolution, a returned relic and a broken treaty averted before it could ever come to blows. Instead, they found Vane waiting for them with 6 hired men from the harbor's rougher quarter, men who worked the docks unloading cargo and were not above unloading a knife into a stranger's back for the right coin, and a magistrate's writ in his hand declaring Vrogash Ironhide an armed foreign agent to be detained on suspicion of inciting unrest. "You should have stayed on your farm, Graves," Vane said, standing on the counting house steps with the writ held up like a shield, his men fanning out across the cobbled square below in the gray afternoon light, fishing carts and market stalls scattering the townsfolk into wide-eyed clusters at the square's edges. "This was never your business. It is bad enough the council let an orc walk through Blackwater unescorted by soldiers, without a farmer playing hero and dragging my family's good name into a dockside rumor." "Your family's good name," Reuben said, standing his ground though his heart was hammering hard enough to shake his ribs, "bought a stolen relic off a deserter and has been sitting on a war debt for 2 generations. That is not a rumor, Vane. That is a fact you have known was coming due since the day I put my name forward for this task. It is a fact that will start a war," Vane snapped, "if that horn is ever produced in public and this orc's clan learns exactly who has been hiding it. I will not lose everything my father built because a farmer with nothing to lose decided to play at being noble." Vrogash had not spoken during this exchange, had simply watched Vane and his 6 hired men with her single molten eye gone very still and very dangerous, the way the sea goes still before a storm breaks, and when she finally did speak, her voice carried across the whole square, calm and clear enough that every fisherman and market wife frozen at its edges heard every word. "You mean to arrest me on a false writ in the middle of your own town square, to hide a theft your father committed, and you have profited from ever since." She took one slow step forward, and Vane's hired men shifted their grips on cudgels and belt knives, and still she did not so much as reach for the long knife at her own hip. "I came south under a flag of peace, Corliss Vane, with an honor guard I left behind at the harbor gate as a gesture of good faith to your council. I have walked your streets unarmed of anything but a belt knife for 18 days, while your townsfolk spat at my shadow and your magistrate smiled at me with poison behind his teeth, and I did not raise my voice once. I am telling you now, in front of every witness in this square, that if you lay one hand on me or on this farmer beside me, you will learn exactly why my clan feared no army on this coast before the peace was signed." For one long, terrible moment nobody moved. Then Corliss Vane, his nerve failing him in front of the gathering crowd, made a sharp gesture, and his 6 hired men surged forward at once. What happened next would be spoken of in Blackwater Harbor for years afterward, retold and reshaped in taverns until it took on the size of legend. But Reuben Graves would remember it always, in perfectly clear and terrible detail. The way Vrogash Ironhide moved like water-given teeth, disarming the first man with a twist of her forearm that sent his cudgel spinning across the cobbles, catching the second man's wrist, and using his own momentum to throw him into a fish cart hard enough to send silver herring scattering across the square. And the way, when the third man lunged not at her but at Reuben, seeing the farmer as the easier target, she had thrown herself bodily between them, taking a glancing blow across the shoulder meant for his skull, and had turned on the man with a snarl that emptied the color from his face before he had even registered being struck himself, sent sprawling by a single open-handed blow that cracked against his jaw like a felled branch. The remaining 3 men, seeing their fellows scattered across the square and understanding all at once exactly what kind of woman they had been paid to detain, broke and ran, and Corliss Vane, left alone on the counting-house steps with his false writ hanging useless in his hand, found himself staring into the gathered, silent crowd of his own townsfolk, who had watched an orc woman take a blow meant for a farmer and give back tenfold in his defense, and who now looked at Vane, not Vrogash, with the cold weight of judgment. She protected him, someone in the crowd said, disbelieving, a fishwife with a basket of nets still held forgotten against her hip. She took the blow meant for him. "Get inside, Vane," Magistrate Pike said, arriving late and red-faced and clearly wishing he had arrived even later, "before you cost this whole town its treaty and its trade both." Vrogash did not so much as look at Vane again. She turned instead to Reuben, her shoulder already darkening with the beginning of a bruise beneath her leathers, and reached up to check, with surprising gentleness for hands that had just felled 3 grown men, the place on his collarbone where a cudgel had grazed him in the scramble. "You are hurt," she said low, all the storm gone out of her voice and something far more raw left in its place. "It is nothing," he said, though his hands were shaking, adrenaline and terror and something fierce and unfamiliar all tangled together in his chest. "You took a blow meant for me, Vrogash. You didn't have to." "I did," she said simply, and there was no room in it for argument. "I have decided, farmer, that I do not intend to let anything happen to you that I have the strength to prevent. I would think by now you would have noticed that about me as well." He had wanted badly to kiss her then, in the middle of the square with half the town still staring, but it was Vrogash who closed the last of the distance between them, cupping his jaw in one broad green hand, tilting his face up to hers, and kissing him with a fierce, hungry gentleness that tasted like salt and adrenaline, and something that felt, absurdly, like coming home. The crowd around them made a collective sound, somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, but neither of them cared in the slightest. And when she finally broke away, her golden eye bright and her breath unsteady, she pressed her forehead to his and said, low enough that only he could hear it, I have wanted to do that since the day you told a magistrate you would rather be nobody than a coward. I have wanted you to do that, he admitted, since you called my hayloft climbing a view worth admiring. That night, Magistrate Pike, shamed in front of the whole harbor by his own townsfolk's outrage and terrified of losing the treaty entirely, was forced to send armed constables to Corliss Vane's counting house with a proper writ of search. And there, in a strong room behind a false wall exactly where old Ossibrant had said it would be, they found the tusk collar, a curved bronze horn, tarnished with age, banded in silver gone dark and dull, wrapped in oilcloth that had not been disturbed in decades. Corliss Vane was stripped of his position, and his family's counting house holdings by council order, the fastest and most thorough justice Blackwater Harbor had handed down in a generation, and the horn itself was brought to the harbor hall to be presented to Vrogash Ironhide in front of the full council and half the town. It should have been the end of the story, the treaty saved, the debt paid, a clean and simple victory. It was not because it was there, in the harbor hall, holding the recovered relic in her hands with the whole town watching, that Vrogash told Reuben the second half of the bargain she had never mentioned before, the wager that would very nearly cost them everything. There is a condition to this recovery I did not tell the council, she said quietly to Reuben, drawing him aside beneath the hall's rafters while Magistrate Pike made florid speeches to the assembled crowd about renewed peace and prosperity. My clan's elders set more than a search when they sent me south, farmer. They set a wager. If the horn was found through honest dealing, without bloodshed within the month, I was to be granted the right to choose my own path afterward, free of the marriage the elders had already arranged for me to a war chief of the Ridge clans I have never once wished to wed. Reuben's stomach dropped. You are promised to someone else. I was promised, she corrected. The wager was my own idea, Reuben, fought for in council against my mother's dying wish and my clan's oldest customs, because I would rather die free than live chained to a man chosen for me by other men's politics. I did not tell you because I did not know, when I first walked into that hall 3 weeks ago, whether the man they gave me to guide me through this town would be worth the risk of hoping for anything at all. Her hand found his, calloused fingers lacing through his own, and her voice dropped lower still. I know now. And if we had failed, he said slowly, understanding at last the full weight of everything she had risked in a search he had thought, foolishly, was only about coin and treaties. If the horn had not been found in a month, then I would have gone north within the week to marry a man I have never loved, to keep a war from breaking over a border neither of us chose to be born beside, she said. That was the wager. That has always been the wager, farmer. I simply did not think, when I made it, that I would find something on this coast worth wagering my whole life against. The problem, as it turned out, was that recovering the horn had not been the whole of the bargain after all. Word had reached the Ridge clans days earlier, carried by a fast rider along the coast road, that the war chief Vrogash had been promised to, a proud, hard-eyed man named Crathok Bonebreaker, had grown impatient waiting on the outcome of a wager he considered beneath his dignity to have ever been proposed, and had ridden south himself with a dozen armed riders to claim his promised bride before any human treaty could interfere with clan custom. He arrived at Blackwater Harbor 3 days after the horn was recovered, while the whole town was still giddy with the relief of averted war, and he arrived exactly as Reuben and Vrogash were walking together along the cliff road above the fishing village, the horn wrapped in cloth and carried carefully in Vrogash's own hands to be delivered north the following week under proper clan escort. Crathok Bonebreaker was everything Reuben was not, taller even than Vrogash, thick with battle muscle, scarred across both forearms in the ritual marks of a Ridge clan war chief, and utterly certain of his right to whatever he wanted. He rode up the cliff road with his dozen men fanned out behind him, cutting off the path back toward the village, and looked at Vrogash, and then at Reuben standing beside her with an expression of pure, contemptuous disbelief. "They told me the wager was won," Crathok said, dismounting with unhurried, deliberate menace, his voice a deep, grinding rumble. "They did not tell me you had spent your month south warming a human farmer's bed instead of preparing to honor the clan's arrangement, Ironhide." "The wager was for my freedom to choose," Vrogash said, her chin lifting, her voice carrying none of the fear Reuben felt hammering through his own chest. "I have chosen." "That was always the term, Crathok, whether it pleases you or not." "The Elders' Council can be persuaded to see it differently," Crathok said. "Once I bring you home regardless of your protests. A bride who arrives unwilling is still a bride, once the marriage rites are spoken over her." His gaze slid to Reuben, dismissive, cold. "And the farmer can be left here with the rest of the human wreckage on this coast, once he understands what happens to men who reach above their station." He gestured, and two of his riders moved their horses forward, flanking the narrow cliff path, cutting off retreat toward the village below, while the rest closed the distance behind, and Reuben understood with the clear, cold logic of genuine fear that they were now trapped on a strip of clifftop road with a war chief and 12 armed riders between them and every safety Blackwater Harbor could offer. "Run for the village," Vrogash said to him, low and urgent, not taking her eye off Crathok. "I can hold them long enough for—" "No," Reuben said, and the word came out steadier than he felt because he had already decided, somewhere between the moment Crathok dismounted and this one, that he was not going to be the man who ran while she fought alone. "I'm not leaving you to be dragged north by a man you have already refused. We face this together or not at all, Vrogash." Crathok laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Together. Listen to him playing at courage. Very well, farmer, I will make this simple." He drew the massive curved blade at his hip, its edge catching the gray afternoon light. "You may forfeit your claim on her now and walk away whole, or you may insist on this foolishness, and I will show you exactly what a human farmer is worth against a war chief of the Ridge clans." The path they stood on ran along the very edge of the cliff, the rock face dropping sheer and jagged 40 feet down to a narrow, churning inlet where the tide surged white against half-submerged boulders, the kind of drop that meant almost certain death for anyone who fell wrong, and only the barest, most desperate chance of survival for anyone who leapt it right. Reuben looked at that drop. He looked at Vrogash, at the fierce, frightened love in her single golden eye, the first time he had ever seen fear there since they'd met. He looked at Crathok's men closing the last of the distance on the path, blades drawn, retreat cut off in both directions, and he made, in the space of a single racing heartbeat, the most reckless decision of his entire life. "Vrogash," he said, "do you trust me?" "With my life," she said, without a heartbeat's hesitation, "though I confess I do not yet know what you intend to do with it." "Then jump with me," he said, and took her hand, and together they ran the last 3 strides to the cliff's edge and threw themselves off it, into open air, while Crathok's furious shout of denial was torn away by the wind and the sea roared up to meet them. The fall felt endless and instant at once, the wind screaming past them, the water below rushing up gray and white and terrifyingly close, and Vrogash's arms wrapped around him midair with fierce, sure strength, turning her own body to take the brunt of the impact. And then the sea slammed into them both like a wall, and the cold shocked every thought from Reuben's mind at once. They went under, tumbling in the surge, and for one long, black moment Reuben lost all sense of up or down, his lungs already burning, and then a strong hand closed around his collar and hauled him upward, breaking the surface into gasping, freezing air. Vrogash's arm locked around his chest, kicking them both toward the narrow strip of rocky shore below the cliff where the tide had carved a slim, sheltered inlet out of the stone. They dragged themselves onto the rocks together, soaked through and shaking, coughing seawater, and above them, 40 feet up, Crathok's furious silhouette paced the cliff's edge, unwilling or unable to find a path down the sheer rock face fast enough to catch them, his men already turning their horses to search for a way around. "You," Vrogash gasped, between ragged breaths, staring at Reuben with an expression somewhere between horror and pure incredulous delight, "are either the bravest man I have ever met, farmer, or the single greatest fool on this entire coast." "Can I not be both?" he managed, "if it means we are both still breathing?" She laughed then, wild and disbelieving, and hauled him into her arms right there on the wet rocks, kissing him with a desperate, fierce hunger that had nothing gentle left in it at all, salt water and cold skin, and both their hearts still hammering from the fall. And when she finally pulled back, her forehead against his, she said, low and rough, "Nobody has ever leapt off a cliff for me before, Reuben Graves. I do not know what to do with that except to tell you that I am no longer certain I could survive losing you now, and that is a terror I have not felt since the day I lost this eye." "Then don't lose me," he said. "Choose me instead, properly, in front of everyone, so there is no wager left for anyone to argue about." They could not stay on the rocks, exposed and freezing with Crathok's men still searching the cliff above for a way down, and so they made their way along the narrow tide line, scrambling over slick stone and driftwood, until they found a fisherman's path leading back up into the village from the harbor side, arriving in Blackwater Harbor soaked, bruised, and trailing seawater across the cobbles, to a town already in uproar over the sight of a war chief's riders massing on the cliff road above. It was Magistrate Pike, of all people, shamed thoroughly enough by the recent scandal of Corliss Vane that he was determined to prove Blackwater Harbor capable of honorable dealing, who rallied the harbor's own militia, and a handful of fishing boat captains armed with boat hooks and old muskets to meet Crathok Bonebreaker's riders at the village gate before they could pursue Reuben and Vrogash any further, buying enough time for Vrogash to send an urgent message up the coast road by her own honor guard, who had been waiting at the harbor gate this whole month exactly as she had said, to summon witnesses from her own clan's elder council. What followed, 2 tense days later, was not a battle but a reckoning, held in the open square of Blackwater Harbor itself with the whole town gathered at its edges, fishermen and merchants and net menders standing shoulder to shoulder with Vrogash's own honor guard and 3 elder representatives of the Ridge Clan Council who had ridden south at her summons, while Crathok Bonebreaker stood, furious and thwarted, at the center of it all, still demanding his promised bride. "The wager was witnessed and set by this council before she ever rode south," said the eldest of the clan representatives, a grizzled, one-armed woman named Grishna who had known Vrogash's mother, addressing the assembled crowd in a voice that carried easily across the square. "The horn was recovered within the month, through honest dealing, without bloodshed on Ironhide's part, exactly as the terms required. The wager is won. Her freedom to choose is hers by right, Crathok, and no war chief's impatience changes clan law, however inconvenient you find it. She has chosen a human farmer," Crathok spat, "over a war chief of her own people." "She has chosen," Grishna said simply, "and that was the entire point of the wager you agreed to when it was set. If you cannot honor a bargain struck before your own council, Crathok Bonebreaker, then perhaps it is you, and not this farmer, who should answer for what that says about your worth as a war chief." It was Vrogash herself, though, who ended it, stepping forward into the center of the square where Crathok stood, and every eye in Blackwater Harbor, human and orc alike, turned to watch her do it. "I have fought in 3 border skirmishes and led my own raiding party by the time I was 2 years past my majority," she said, her voice carrying clean and hard across the gathered crowd. "I lost this eye defending a mountain pass that saved 40 of our people, Crathok, and I have never once, in all the years since, let any man tell me what my life was worth or who deserved to share it. I am telling you now, in front of your own elder council and this entire human town, that I choose Reuben Graves freely, with both my heart and my eyes open, the one that sees and the one that does not, and if you wish to challenge that choice, You may challenge me directly, sword to sword, rather than hiding behind a marriage arrangement made before I was old enough to refuse it." Crathok looked at her for a long, taut moment, at the honor guard standing at her back, at the elder council who had already ruled against him, at the gathered human crowd who watched him with open hostility for threatening a woman who had, 3 days past, thrown herself into a raging tide to save a man they had all watched grow up poor and overlooked among them. And something in his pride finally broke beneath the accumulated weight of it. "Keep him then," Crathok said at last, bitter and defeated, swinging back up onto his horse. "But know, Ironhide, that you have shamed your clan's arrangement in front of every human on this coast." "I have honored my own life," Vrogash said, "in front of every witness who matters. That is not shame, Crathok. That is simply a truth you have never learned to live inside of." He rode north within the hour, his riders following, and did not look back, and the peace treaty between Blackwater Harbor and the Ridge clans was formally signed 3 days later in the harbor hall, the recovered tusk-caller presented with full honors, the old blood debt finally, fully paid. That should have been, and in most tellings of this story around Blackwater Harbor's tavern fires afterward, was the end of it. The wager won, the war chief refused, the treaty secured. But there remained, for Reuben and Vrogash, one more bargain still unresolved between them, quieter and more personal than any clan council could settle, and it was struck not in a crowded hall but on the cliff road above the village, 3 weeks later, in the golden light of a late summer evening, in the exact spot where they had once leapt together into the sea. Reuben had spent those 3 weeks in a kind of dazed, disbelieving happiness, working his farm by day with a lightness in his chest he had not felt since before his father's death, and spending every evening he could down at the harbor or up at the small cottage. The council had eventually, grudgingly, arranged for Vrogash to keep while the treaty terms were finalized, since her clan had agreed she might remain on the southern coast if she chose, given the unusual circumstances of the wager's outcome. He had never once in all those weeks asked her outright what came next, terrified in some small, unhealed part of himself that a woman like Vrogash Ironhide, who could have chosen any warrior, any war chief, any powerful match her clan could arrange, might eventually tire of a poor farmer's small, quiet life on a struggling homestead, once the excitement of the wager and the cliff and the whole town's drama had faded into ordinary days. It was Vrogash, unsurprisingly, who forced the question into the open, meeting him on the cliff road at dusk with the tusk-caller's payment, the 40 crowns the council owed him for his role in its recovery, already secured against his farm's debt weeks earlier, and something else besides held in her hands. A length of braided leather cord, dyed deep red, worked through with small polished stones the color of sea glass. "Do you know what this is, farmer?" she asked, holding it up between them as the sun sank orange and gold over the water. "I do not," he admitted. "It is a binding cord," she said. "Among my people, when a warrior chooses a partner freely, without arrangement, without clan politics, she offers this. It is not a wedding rite exactly, not the kind your harbor magistrate would recognize with papers and witnesses, though we may have that too, if you wish it, for the sake of your own people's customs. It is older than that. It is a promise a woman makes with her own hands, that she has looked at a man clearly with everything she has, and chosen to bind her life to his regardless of what either of them stands to lose by it." Reuben's throat had gone tight. "Vrogash, I know what I am," she said, before he could find further words, stepping close enough that he could see in the dying light every detail of her face he had come to love without ever quite naming it as such. The scar, the golden eye, the strong set of her jaw. "I know what I could have had if I had let the elders arrange my whole life for me. A war chief, land, standing among my own people that a farmer's wife could never match. I have thought of all of it, these 3 weeks, lying awake in that cottage wondering if I have been a fool to walk away from all of it for a homestead struggling against blight and debt and bad fences." She reached up, tracing the same slow line along his jaw that she had that very first week, when neither of them had yet admitted what was growing between them. And I have decided, every single time, that I would rather have your fences than his fortune, Reuben Graves. I would rather stand beside a man who leapt off a cliff for me than sit beside one who would have dragged me back to a life I never chose. I'm not offering you this cord because my clan expects it, or because a wager demanded it. I am offering it because I looked at you clearly, with the eye I have left, and it was more than enough to see everything I needed to know. He took the cord from her hands, and his own were not steady at all. I have nothing to give you in return that matches this, he said. A farm that is barely solvent, a house with a leaking roof, a life that will mean hard work and thin winters more often than not. You are giving me the only thing I have ever wanted and never once been offered honestly, she said. A choice, freely made by a man who sees me and stays anyway. That is worth more to me than every crown your council owes either of us, Reuben. I am not asking you to match a fortune. I am asking you to let me stay. Then stay, he said, his voice breaking on the word, and wound the cord around both their joined hands, exactly as she showed him, binding it in the old way beneath the darkening sky. Stay, and I will spend every season we have making sure you never once regret choosing a farmer's fences over a war chief's fortune. She kissed him then, slow and certain, with none of the desperate urgency of the cliff or the square, just a deep, settled warmth that felt like the tide finally coming to rest after a long storm. And when she finally drew back, her golden eye bright with unshed tears she made no effort to hide, she pressed her forehead to his and murmured, I have spent so many years being feared, farmer, or pitied, or looked at as half a woman because of what this scar cost me. You have never once looked at me as half of anything. You have always looked at me as though I am entirely enough, exactly as I am, I and scar and all. I do not think you understand what a rare gift that is, to a woman who has spent a lifetime being seen as broken. You are not broken, he said fiercely. You are the strongest, most alive person I have ever met, Vrogash Ironhide, and I would take one evening with you over 100 safe, ordinary years without you. I have been alone a long time, too. I did not know how much until you walked into that harbor hall and decided, for reasons I still do not fully understand, that I was worth trusting. I understood it the moment I met you, she said. It only took you a little longer to catch up. They were married properly, in the harbor town's own tradition, 3 weeks after that evening on the cliff road, in a small ceremony at Reuben's farm that drew, to everyone's surprise, a genuinely respectable crowd. Widow Hask, grudgingly fond after weeks of haggling, several fishing families whose sons Vrogash had helped repair storm-damaged nets during her long weeks in town. Even Magistrate Pike, eager to be seen supporting the peace he had signed his own name to, though Reuben suspected his presence had more to do with politics than genuine warmth. Grishna and 2 other elders from the Ridge Clan Council rode south to stand witness as well, an honor Vrogash told him quietly meant more to her than she could easily put into words, since it meant her own people had chosen, in the end, to recognize a bond her clan's old customs had never anticipated. The farm itself, in the months that followed, transformed in ways Reuben could scarcely have imagined a year before. Vrogash's strength, honed by years as a warrior, proved as useful mending fences and hauling timber as it had ever been in battle, and she took to the rhythms of homestead work with the same fierce, focused determination she brought to everything else, though she never once let him forget, with a teasing edge that still made his pulse race even after months of marriage, that she considered farm labor a poor substitute for the excitement of a good cliffside leap. I miss it sometimes, she admitted one evening months later, as they sat together on the porch watching the last light fade over the wheat fields, her arms slung comfortably around his shoulders, his head resting against her collarbone in a position that had become, over the seasons, entirely natural to both of them. Not the danger exactly, but that feeling of not knowing if the ground beneath your feet would hold, Farm life is steadier than that. Steadier isn't the same as boring, he said. Ask the pig that got loose into Widow Hask's garden last month if farm life lacks excitement. Vrogash laughed, the sound warm and easy in the quiet evening air. A sound he had learned over the seasons was reserved almost entirely for him, rare and precious as it had been the very first time he'd heard it on that dockside sea wall. That pig, she said, was more trouble than Crathok Bone Breaker and considerably harder to reason with. You did threaten to eat it, he pointed out. I threatened, she said, and then I spent an hour chasing it through the widow's cabbages instead, because you asked me nicely not to actually eat it, and I find, to my own great surprise, that I cannot refuse you very much when you ask nicely. She turned, pressing a kiss to his temple, unhurried and certain, the golden light of evening catching the old scar across her missing eye and the fierce, contented warmth in the one that remained. I did not think, farmer, when I walked into that harbor hall a year ago, missing an eye and carrying a wager I was not certain I could win, that I would end up here. A homestead on a wild coast. A husband who leapt off a cliff rather than let me face a war chief alone. A life steadier and stranger, and better than anything the elders ever tried to arrange for me. I did not think, Reuben said, that the bravest, most beautiful woman I would ever meet would walk into that hall and choose me, out of every man in that room, because I happened to look at her scar for exactly as long as it took to see the rest of her. He took her hand, the one that still wore the faded, weathered leather cord from that first binding on the cliff road, now joined by a second, newer cord she had woven herself over the winter, thicker and more elaborate, a private tradition between them that had nothing to do with clan custom and everything to do with the life they had built. I would leap off that cliff again tomorrow, Vrogash, if it meant landing exactly here beside you every single time. Good, she said, low and warm, drawing him close in the fading light. Because I intend to keep choosing you, Reuben Graves, for every season we have left, and I would think by now you would have learned that when Vrogash Ironhide chooses something, she does not let it go easily. I have noticed, he said, smiling against her collarbone as the last light faded over the fields and the sea wind carried up from the harbor below, salt and wood smoke, and the distant cry of gulls, the whole rugged, hard-won coast settling into evening around the small, sturdy farmhouse that had somehow become, against every poor odd either of them had once faced alone, exactly enough for both of them. The harvest that year was the best the farm had seen in a decade, wheat standing tall and golden in fields. Vrogash had helped clear of stone and old rot with her own 2 hands. And when the last cart was loaded and the debt to Blackwater Harbor's bank finally, fully cleared, Reuben stood in the yard with Vrogash beside him, watching the sun set over land that no longer felt like a burden he carried alone, and understood, with the same clear certainty he had felt leaping off that cliff a year before, that he had gained far more that spring than a wager won or a relic recovered. He had gained a woman who had looked at him, truly looked, with the single fierce eye that had seen enough of war and grief and hard-won survival to know exactly what was worth choosing when she finally found it, and had decided, against every easier path her own people's customs might have offered her, that a struggling farmer on a wild, rocky coast was worth staying for. And Vrogash Ironhide, standing in the golden light of her own hard-won harvest, her hand woven tight through Reuben's, the old scar across her missing eye no longer a mark of what she had lost in some long-ago border war, but simply a part of the woman he loved entirely, without reservation, without pity, without anything but the same fierce devotion she had shown him from the very first day she chose him out of a crowded hall, knew that she had found at last exactly what she had wagered her whole future to look for: a life freely chosen, a home firmly rooted, and a love that neither treaty nor war chief nor old clan custom would ever again have the power to take from her. They stood together in the fading light until the stars came out over the wild coast, the sea wind carrying the sound of the harbor's evening bell up from the village below, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The wager was won. The debt was paid. The bargain that had once bound them together as strangers thrown into danger side by side had become, in the turning of a single hard, bright year, something far simpler and far more enduring than either of them could have imagined that first stormy day on the breaking bridge. Two people, once alone, who had looked at each other clearly, and chosen and stayed.